So I'd like to thank the College of Humanities and Sciences and the Office of Multicultural Student Affairs for their help with promoting this event, as well as the amazing Ronnie Sisaveth, Hope Ward, Brianna Davis, and Bersabe Kimau, as well as the Acting Assistant Director, Eli Costin. Thanks, Eli, for their help with organizing this event today. I'm delighted to introduce our guest for the Health Humanities Speaker Series this evening, Dr. Anna LaQuawn Hinton. Dr. LaQuawn Hinton is an assistant professor of disability studies and Black literature and culture in the English department at the University of North Texas. She has published on disability in constructions of Black motherhood, masculinity in hip hop, spaces of incarceration, reproductive justice in literature, and African and Afro-diasporic spiritual practice as technology. She is currently writing a book, Refusing to be Made Whole, Disability in Contemporary Black Women's Writing, which approaches conversations about aesthetics, spirituality, representation, community, sexuality, motherhood, and futurity. Dr. LaQuawn Hinton is also Public Relations Director for the College Language Association, a member of the Executive Committee for the Transdisciplinary Connections Disability Studies Forum for the Modern Language Association, and a member of the Committee for Persons with Disabilities for the City of Denton in Texas. She identifies as a disabled queer mama Black feminist who, citing Alice Walker, quote, loves music, loves dance, loves the moon, loves the spirit, loves love and food and roundness, loves struggle, loves the folk, and striving to love herself regardless, loves herself regardless. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Hinton.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Thank you for having me. I am honored and thrilled to be here to share this work with all of you this afternoon, this evening. What I'll be sharing today is some work, parts of my work that deals with reproductive justice and disability studies, and specifically conversations around Black maternal mortality. So just a warning, we'll be diving into those topics and discussions. So I never really wanted to be a mom when I was younger. I was fortunate that having children was never a destiny that I felt compelled to do. As I got older, ableism told me I shouldn't have children. Some genes should not be passed on, and I did not have the good kind. In graduate school, after being transformed by disability studies, I realized that I wanted to have a child. I, with my bad genes, wanted to be in the world, had no regrets that my mom, who had much less choice, but agency nevertheless, decided to bring me into this world. As a self-proclaimed Black feminist troublemaker, Alexis Pauline Gumbs beautifully and brilliantly writes of us children born in the 80s. When poor Black young motherhood seemed to reach the height of its demonization. And here's a quote: "The queer thing is that we were born. Our young and or deviant and or brown and or broke and or single mamas did the wrong thing. Therefore, we exist. A population out of control, a story interrupted. We are the guerrilla poems written on walls, purveyors of a billion dangerous meanings of life." So I decided to have a child. The month I learned I was pregnant, I learned that a friend's cousin who had been expecting, who went into the hospital for a normal birth, somehow lost her child. The fall of my first trimester, I watched the conclusion of the George Zimmerman trial in abject horror. I remember calling and hysterically crying to my mommy, "What have I done?" I chose to stay pregnant. I chose to use the care of midwives and have a home birth, which fortunately was covered through my grad school funded insurance with lower copays than traditional routes to boot. I had a healthy pregnancy and gave birth to a baby girl child. All throughout, I had choice. The choices that I had epitomized the goals of reproductive justice as defined by brilliant scholar activists like Loretta Ross. I had a choice and probably, to be honest, good luck, not to have children when I didn't want to. I had the choice to give birth when I wanted to, and every day I fight to raise my birth child and any other child that crosses my path in a place that is safe and conducive to their aliveness and self-actualization. Every step of the way as a fat, Black, queer person has been work. It has been work inspired and encouraged by those at the intersections of reproductive justice and disability justice, both close to me and those at large. I do not take for granted that I was and continue to be immensely privileged in the experiences and choices that I have had. As Alexis Pauline Gumbs also declares, the queer thing is that we are still here. As a fat Black woman, my pregnancy was initially going to be medicalized. Although I was smaller than I am today, I was still obese and would have been high risk. The midwives I worked with, however, disagreed. I was healthy and there was no reason to subject myself to the surveillance and hypermedicalization that being deemed high risk entails. Short moments with traditional medical practitioners during my pregnancy led me to believe that this alternative choice saved my life. Today, it is no secret, it is dangerous, deadly to give birth while Black. While it has been known for some time that Black people who give birth die at disproportionate rates than white birthing people, up to 3 to 4 times higher, as the overall maternal mortality rates increase in the US compared to other wealthy nations, and as Black women have gained access to larger audiences for their reproductive justice work and activism, and in note this small part, thanks to social media, US culture at large is being pressured to openly discuss this issue and challenged to develop solutions. With my work, I want to add that we must include a critical disability analysis to our conversations about Black maternal life and death. Not only are disabled Black people who birth experiencing high maternal and infant mortality rates, not to mention the additional barriers to accessing good prenatal care and information about sexual and reproductive health, period. Becoming disabled is also a consequence of birthing while Black. Indeed, a Black feminist disability studies methodology requires that we broaden our understanding of disability to account for conditions that Black people experience as debilitating, such as hypertension and diabetes, some of the pre-existing conditions that folks blame for high maternal mortality rates and morbidity rates. I argue that we should not owe people evidence of our health to deserve better outcomes. With that understanding, it becomes clear that our conversations around Black maternal and infant death is a disability justice issue. So, medical researchers have been quick to point out that Black mothers are dying because they're more likely to have pre-existing conditions, more difficult pregnancies, and more complications during delivery, as well as an overall heightened distrust of medical personnel because of their perceived, this is a word in the research, racial mistreatment by medical staff. As one group of scholars have pointed out, and I quote, "It is common to blame women for their own deaths. Many scientific publications have cited that women were coming to pregnancy older, called advanced maternal age or geriatric pregnancy, and that hits about 35 in that geriatric stage. Sicker with hypertension, diabetes, or other chronic illnesses, and fatter, that is with obesity. But even in studies that control for age, chronic disease, and obesity, the MMR in the US still far exceeds rates in similarly wealthy nations. In a 2016 report that looked at pregnancy-related death disparities among states, the authors wrote that excellent care is apparently available, but is not reaching all the people. I want to come back to that last point in a minute. But for now, let's say I agree with the authors of this research. Yes, we need to stop blaming women for dying. Absolutely, yes. As these researchers go on to continue, these causes, however, evade evidence that demonstrates that Black women have higher mortality rates across class lines. It's not just a result of poverty, which increases poor health outcomes. In other words, access to wealth and resources still doesn't close the gap between the rate of Black birthing folk dying compared to those who are non-Black. Nevertheless, conversations about Black maternal mortality continue to rely on biomedical explanations that fault Black women for dying upwards of 3 times more than white and non-Black women of color while giving birth. It seems we simply aren't healthy enough or taking care enough of ourselves. However, the way this article from the Scientific American frames the issue of pre-existing conditions fails to examine the ableism and fat phobia inherent in these attitudes. Pre-existing conditions should not and need not result in high maternal mortality and morbidity rates. I cannot stress enough the importance of naming ableism as a factor enmeshed and constitutive of the misogynoir at work. Ableism and misogynoir are co-constitutive and operate in collusion to strip Black birthing people of agency before they even conceive. Ableism is the preference for the able body or mind, or as the Access Living website so clearly explains, ableism is the discrimination of and social prejudice against people with disabilities based on the belief that typical abilities are superior. At its heart, ableism is rooted in the assumption that disabled people require fixing and defines people by their disability. Like racism, sexism, ableism classifies entire groups of people as less than and includes harmful stereotypes, misconceptions, and generalizations of people with disabilities. Misogynoir is a term that our academic scholar Moya Bailey coined, and she says it's pronounced misogynoir. And it's a term I created in 2008 to describe the anti-Black racist misogyny that Black women experience, particularly in the US visual and digital culture. Misogynoir is not simply the racism that Black women encounter, nor is it the misogyny that Black women negotiate. Misogynoir describes the uniquely co-constitutive, racialized, and sexist violence that befalls Black women as a result of their simultaneous and interlocking oppressions at the intersection of racial and gender marginalization. And as Bailey suggests in an interview about the term in her book, misogynoir in our society is a question of care. The root of misogynoir is how people perceive and treat Black women and understand them to be worthy of respect and care. I contend that the ableism that creates barriers to reproductive agency for more traditionally or stereotypically disabled people of all races is operative in what we consider the Black and mostly able-bodied maternal crisis. Based on the social and medical discourse around Black birthing experiences and outcomes, we configure the Black birthing body as simultaneously able-bodied and disabled. The Black birthing body is figured as defective and sick, yet unnaturally so because of the racism that is often the loci of debilitation. Consequently, we blame poor health, or ultimately disability, as the determining factor of mortality and morbidity rates. Even when we critique racism as a central mediating factor of maternal care, implied is still the ableist belief that had these bodies not been disabled, the outcome would have been different. The disabled Black birthing body is still the ultimate cause of its own death. Consequently, the focus has been on health. And don't get me wrong, preventing preventable pain, sickness, and suffering is part of disability justice. At the same time, I join theorists of health and disability who push back and complicate the discursive uses of health to designate some bodies as worthy and others as not. For instance, in his book, Against Health, How Health Became the New Morality, MD and medical historian Jonathan Metzler argues that health is a term replete with value judgments, hierarchies, and blind assumptions that speak as much about power and privilege as they do about well-being. Health is a desired state, but it is also a prescribed state in an ideological position. Metzler goes on to explain, instead, even the most cursory examination of health in daily conversations, email solicitation, or media representation demonstrates how the term is used to make moral judgments, convey prejudice, sell products, or even to exclude whole groups of persons from health care. This is central to concerns about race because, as reproductive justice scholar and activist Dorothy Roberts states in her contribution to his book, debates about the ethics of these biotechnologies that enable biocitizenship often pit health against social justice. Our societal demand for health stems from the ableist devaluation of illness and sickness. We assume that disabled people are sick, and because they are sick, that the value of their lives is diminished. By being attentive to ableism in our focus on misogynoir and reproductive justice, we can challenge and redirect conversations that focus on Black maternal health instead of systemic racism and ableism. Unhealthy Black bodies matter, and the intersections of disability justice and reproductive justice enable us to recognize this. This becomes clear in cases that are well known and widely discussed, such as those experienced by celebrities. We see even those who are famous and rich, such as Beyonce, share horror stories about being pregnant and birthing while Black. In a cover story for Vogue, Beyonce told journalist Clover Hope that I was 218 pounds the day I gave birth to Rumi and Sir. I was swollen from toxemia and had been on bed rest for over a month. My health and my baby's health were in danger, so I had an emergency C-section. We spent many weeks in the NICU. Many pop culture news outlets framed the Vogue piece as a body positivity story. Beyonce expresses self-love for post-baby fupa, but Bey makes it clear, shit got real. She says, I was in survival mode and did not grasp it all until months later. Beyonce is not the only Black celebrity to come forward about harrowing birth experiences. Pop singer and actress Tatiana Ali and six-time Olympic gold medalist Allison Felix have both discussed their near-death birth stories. Serena Williams' birth story is particularly telling. Serena Williams, a Black woman powerhouse, shared how she nearly died from a pulmonary embolism after birthing her daughter. In a story for CNN, Serena writes, it began with a pulmonary embolism, which is a condition in which one or more arteries in the lungs becomes blocked by a blood clot. Because of my medical history with the problem, I live in fear of this situation. So when I fell short of breath, I did not wait to alert the nurses. This sparked a slew of health complications that I am lucky to have survived. First, my C-section wound popped open due to the intense coughing I endured as a result of the embolism. I returned to surgery where the doctors found a large hematoma, a swelling of clotted blood in my abdomen, and then I returned to the operating room for a procedure that prevents clots from traveling to my lungs. When I finally made it home to my family, I had to spend the first 6 weeks of motherhood in bed. These two stories are instructive and telling. One, because they reveal what many scholars and researchers have demonstrated, that poor maternal health outcomes extends the bounds of class and caste in the US. Next, because they were able to garner their effective thrust by the status of these celebrities' health. Both Beyonce and Serena Williams are the epitome of good health. If this could happen to them, this could happen to anyone. However, I would like to pause and challenge this narrative about their health. In this instance, we see that health is fluid, it's moving, and it's changing. It's not consistent, it's not stable. Generally, both women are healthy. In these instances, they were not. Beyonce shares that her pregnancy had been complicated throughout in ways that compromised her health. And a deeper dive into Serena's story reveals that she was experiencing the complications of an ongoing disability. The journalism venues have cited Serena's story over and again as an example of the extent and reach of Black women's mortality rates as a public health crisis. Yet what has largely gone uncommented on are her ongoing encounters with ableism. Williams has a condition that makes her more susceptible to blood clots, which made her more aware of the risks during her childbirth. However, post-pregnancy, Serena was especially worried about clots and wore a compression catsuit to the French Open, for which she was attacked. Bernard Guidelli, president of the French Open, claimed that Williams's catsuit was inappropriate and disrespectful to the profession. He called for modesty. He refused to let her wear it. In other words, Guidelli denied Williams's accommodations because he sexualized her Black disabled femme body. Here we see how constructions of Black womanhood erase or make invisible the complex and dynamic experiences with one's body as it navigates the spectrum of wellness, unwellness, hyperabled, and disabled in this instance. Even at the time where she is in her best physical conditions in other respects, she's unwell in others. Even when she is seeking to use access technologies, it is demonized through negative tropes about Black womanhood and motherhood and denied her in ways that put her at risk, even after or while she's not pregnant. Williams was denied the use of access technology because her body was read through racist stereotypes about Black women. In this case, Black women as hypersexual. Her case raises important questions about what we overlook with our necessarily focus on Black maternal death. Theorists of Blackness and disability have pointed out that we need to expand what experiences and conditions we include under the umbrella of disability, because Black people are more likely to be disabled through chronic illnesses, such as some of the already listed conditions like hypertension, diabetes, etc., instead of just congenital disabilities or accidents. How already Black people make up a disproportionate 25% of disabled people in the US. Indeed, far too many Black people experience reproductive health as an issue of disability, injustice, and misogyny. Black women are more likely to experience reproductive health disorders such as fibroids and endometriosis, which can be debilitating in their symptoms. The COVID-19 pandemic, which, as with all social crises, hit Black populations especially hard, has increased the number of unhealthy disabled people substantially and in ways not yet quantified. While maybe we should aspire to health, it shouldn't be a justification, a prerequisite for Black life. And we also need to focus on what it's like to live in the wake of all this Black death in these conversations. Currently, there's very little research on disabled mothers. For one, society desexualizes disabled people, which therefore has allowed disabled people to remain invisible in reproductive rights and justice discourse. Two, most disabled folks lack access to the power and privilege of a platform from which to articulate their experiences. Disabled people have sex and give birth too. I mean, that's a surprise for many people. As one research report put it, disabled people are nearly as likely to experience pregnancy as women without disabilities. Because of ableist assumptions about disabled women's sexuality, they aren't provided, however, information about sex, sexuality, pregnancy, or childbirth. For many, simply visiting the doctor's office is inaccessible. Examination tables aren't accessible for those who use wheelchairs. There are no interpreters for deaf or hard of hearing. Doctors aren't trained to, nor do they have the time to communicate clearly and effectively with people who have cognitive disabilities. Consequently, disabled women across racial backgrounds, but especially Black disabled women, face severely poor health outcomes when they do. Although the outlook is bleak here too, the ability to name ableism as operative has led to seedlings of change that are insightful and useful for reproductive justice imperatives broadly. For instance, the educational literature that Brandeis University's National Center for Disability and Pregnancy Research produces for cognitively disabled birthing people is clear and accessible. They take great time and care to explain what it is that is going on in the person's body and what to expect next in the process. The literature takes great time and care to provide resources that is articulated for those who may be working with others who collaborate in their care, such as caregivers and aides. Much of the research is conversant with doctors. They're instructive to how those who treat disabled people can improve their practice. The research is less centered at pathologizing the disabled person's body. The writing and videos demonstrate seriousness about these consumers' dignity and right to information to improve their pregnancy experience and outcomes. They're not infantilizing. They aren't judgmental. While society typically views those who are cognitively disabled and others, such as those who are young, as making poor choices about their reproductive health when they become pregnant, and therefore veer into moralizing lectures about the consequences of their errors, the research present here avoids that. It accepts them as having agency or accepts their conditions as they are and is invested clearly in making sure that they have the most knowledge to exercise the most of their rights as possible. Most importantly, by addressing ableism in their research, they demonstrate that unwellness does not have to preclude a healthy and live birth. Returning to that previous article that I quoted from the Scientific American, studies of birth outcomes in other countries showed that death and further debilitation from pre-existing conditions and disabilities are preventable. Once again, we do not owe our health to demand changed outcomes. These issues are more important than ever. Despite vaccinations, boosters, masking, etc., I personally have contracted COVID-19 3 different times now. Fortunately, I was spared grappling with the original, more deadly strain. Nevertheless, my body has changed. For months at a time, I am now unhealthy and fat. And as I continue to take pride and perform the labor of mothering in different capacities, I recognize that if I choose to birth again, I might have a very different trajectory than my first experience. This is not necessarily just or only because of my changed body, but because we live within a society where our birth care system does not have the political, social, and practical infrastructure to meet the needs of the swelling populations of birth-capable people affected by COVID-19, like myself. Our disabled landscape is changing in ways that we cannot anticipate and predict. And as we enter into discourses about the other challenges to reproductive justice, addressing misogyny and ableism will be more of an imperative than it has ever been, especially if we want to protect and change the outcomes for Black birthing people and Black children. Thank you.
I have a comment. This topic interests me as a 27-year-old in a serious relationship who has always thought about around the age of 30 is when I'll start a family. And probably about 2 to 3 years ago is when I started hearing about mortality rates for Black women. And ever since I heard it, it has truly been in the back of my mind as something that scares me for when that time comes. And I appreciate what you talked about today, specifically the idea of not blaming our own bodies and the women for what happens to us during pregnancy. And I also appreciate sharing the more detailed information about the celebrity side of what they went through, because I think that's something that I was missing in some of my experiences reading on this. Is I did think that maybe with money comes better outcomes. So it is, I don't want to say, I still feel uneasy, but I think I also feel hopeful that there's people like you and other individuals that are working and researching. And I feel all that I can do is educate myself and use that education to speak during that moment in time. So I just wanted to say thank you for sharing the information today. It really touched me as someone who would like to start a family in the very near future, but the information I hear about Black women just really scares the living daylights out of me and really, really makes me just think about, is starting a family worth my life? So, thank you.
Thank you for sharing, and thank you for sharing, being very vulnerable, sharing your feelings around it. I think that fear is something that others also experience as they continue to shape and plan for their lives. And I think this is also where we can learn from those who have been actively naming ableism. For many, presumably able-bodied women, often when it comes to reproductive care, this is our first time in the medical system, in any kind of extensive capacity. And so it's foreign. What's beautiful about coalition and working with disabled women or disabled people of all races, but particularly Black disabled women, this is an experience that they're already used to. Working in how to navigate medical systems, whether it's in capacity of trying to receive reproductive care or other forms of care. And so I have taken great strength from the
Do you know if this affects more women who have like delivered vaginal deliveries or like the C-section?
So while there are so many studies right now that's looking at these rates and pinpointing who's more likely to experience maternal mortality in that respect is outside of my area and expertise. I think what you might find useful are those who's doing work of expanding and pushing for even more dynamic birth experiences besides just the vaginal cesarean debate. And where my work would fit in with that is to recognize that regardless of choices and what ends up happening in terms of the birthing experience, this is a systemic issue, the misogyny and the ableism. This is what happens when you go in for the appointment. This is the assumptions that we make about what bodies can and can't do, what treatments are and aren't available. And what that means inevitably is that, or what I take from that conclusion is that as much as we try to make these micro choices that may improve the odds, like I was like, oh my goodness, I have to have a vaginal birth because if you have a C-section, it's going to go through this whole line because that was like the conversation during the time, right? Ultimately, when you're dealing with systemic forces, nothing can save you without joining in with those who are also doing that work and countering them. Does that answer or provide an answer? So yeah,
I had 2 C-sections, and for my last daughter, I had her in 2022, and I was terrified to have a second one. Most of the time, if you have a C-section, the first delivery, they recommend that you have a second one, and I wanted to have a vaginal. I was told that it would be better for me to have a C-section.
That's another rabbit hole of research.
They
White culture around that.
at significantly higher rates than they have Black and brown women. Like there is actually empirical data that shows that the vaginal birth after cesarean is offered more to non-Hispanic white women and non-Hispanic white women of higher socioeconomic.
Beautiful in so many ways to hear your vulnerability and story, and then also like obviously these are daunting and really haunting statistics, and I very much related because I was 34 when I got pregnant, because I was due at 35 geriatric pregnancy. And of course, all of these statistics, all of these like numbers, your age, your weight, all of these things that would dictate what your birthing experience would be, and wanting those numbers not to be what determined my outlook. But there was another, I really also appreciated the discussions about disability and ableism, because that is absolutely something that's absent from the conversation. Even when I've written on my experience of these things, that wasn't something that I was as versed in. So I'm grateful for that. There was something you said as well when you were thinking about, when I think you were pregnant at the time, you said you were watching the murder of George Floyd, and you called your mother and said, you know, what have I done? What have I decided to do, right? And it reminded me a bit of Claudia Rankin's piece on the condition of Black life is one of mourning, where she talks about how her friend gave birth, and as soon as she gave birth, she's like, I need to leave the States. I got to get out of here. Like, what does it mean to be in this precarious condition as a Black mother, to know that the possibility of harm to your child is like ever present? And so I wanted to also get your kind of perspective on those kinds of ethical choices, because it's not just a choice. And I love the fact that you were emphasizing choice, because that is a privilege to have the choice to give birth and when and all of that. But there's another ethical concern that shows up in so much literature. Think about Helga Crane, thinking about in Quicksand, what does it mean to give birth to people who will suffer, and things along those lines. And of course, I'm not equating Black life to suffering. I think Monty Perry is taught as well not to do that, right? But I'm thinking about that kind of ethical conversation too. And you also talked about it in relationship to just the ableist kind of rhetoric that made you feel as if passing on your genes, right, and giving birth was somehow not worthy in some way. So I guess I just want to hear your perspective on the ethics, those ethics about bringing into life a person that might be vulnerable to harm, but then also as someone who has dealt with disability, thinking about the rhetoric about your worthiness and giving.
Ooh, thank you for such a considerate question. Yeah, I was pregnant when during the George Zimmerman trial, and when he got that not guilty verdict. And that was a moment where the Black women's literary tradition, because I'm in literary studies, properly hit home in a way that I wasn't expecting to. I even now, as you speak, I think back to, for instance, some of the lynching plays by Georgia Douglas Johnson, where you have these heroines and they're like, do I keep this baby alive? Now that I realize that we're in this Jim Crow Southern landscape. And not to say that that was it, but it is a consideration. And this is where I think I'm very much informed, both in my mother work personally and in my scholarship, by disability justice, reproductive justice, particularly as that outlined by like a Loretta Ross or Alexis Pauline Gumbs and others, where mother work isn't necessarily tethered to the actually having a child of one's own. This is labor that you do. So also Patricia Hill Collins, Bell Hooks, and others who are theorizing this, but also staking a claim for Black life. I won't say that I have any clear cut and dry solutions, but I will say that I use my own experience to join those who are theorizing what reproductive rights and justice is beyond just access to abortion, and that is the right to raise the children that you have. And this becomes also a disability justice issue, particularly in our conversations around state-sanctioned violence, because those who have been targeted, for instance, in these very notorious cases of police brutality, deathly violence, have been disabled. Many have we talk about most of the cases where those who have died as a result of these encounters, but there are just as many cases where those people who come out disabled, whether it's paralyzed, and we can't even talk about the trauma. And so framing this as framing these as, once again, another place where disability justice and reproductive justice collapse for racial justice. And using that, if not as an answer to that personal dilemma, as a source of strength and hope and motivation. But that's very much how I frame my work. Like these are all part of that particular tenet of reproductive justice, the ability to raise children that you have. Does that answer your question?
Question about factors. So there's a lot of alternative birthing I've been doing, such as like first doulas and midwives, and creating a team of like Black professionals, or at least professionals that understand the impact of systemic racism on bodies that fit demographics of minorities. I was just wondering if you had any other knowledge, or if you any other research that talks about protective factors that mothers or just parents can use in terms of giving a safe birth. I'd just like to know about that.
So thank you for that. I find the Black midwives, Black doula movements beautiful and necessary. They provide a different form of activism, as like you said, as a corrective and protective. And they're so effective in part, I contend, because embedded in them are anti-ableist frames of approaching pregnancy in the human body. So I share my story, for instance, of choosing to use a midwife in a home birth, because, and mentioning that they didn't automatically place me at high risk because I was fat, because inherent in there is a different way of approaching bodies that doesn't automatically pathologize those that come without the norms. Traditional doctors, they get a certain set of facts, your age, your weight, et cetera, and immediately if you don't fit into a narrow frame, it's pathologized, and it opens you up into a different set of encounters within industrial complex. What you see with these other spaces are those who are using knowledge that has been systematically discredited, but is rooted in community, to try to create different birthing experiences. So we see and to create more accessible spaces. So I have a dear friend and colleague, Stacey McCormick, and she was doing work with a local birthing justice center in our DFW area. And they were really big, for instance, in working with not just cisgender birthing people, but trans and gender non-conforming and fluid, and just different sexual orientations and ways that took to account the specific birthing needs. And so I may not have any, I think those are some of the core ones, in addition to people working on teaching others how to advocate, which is also influenced by disability justice activism. Like these are scripts you can use when you go into the doctor. These are your rights, and sharing that information. While I don't have much to add besides that, I can say that when you look into those spaces, or when you start to dismantle the ableism within these systems, new possibilities and these other protective ways of engaging in these systems can open up.
Thank you.
Thank you again also for this very informative talk. You kind of touched upon this a little bit. So as a 42-year-old woman who would like to have children, the language. So, hearing geriatric efficacy is, that's not encouraging at all. And the fact that it starts at 35 really is not encouraging. So if you could just kind of share your thoughts on like language, and especially as it relates with disability justice and Black motherhood and so forth.
So thank you for that question. I tried to be intentional in language. So for instance, using birthing people versus women, et cetera. Once again, I get from my colleague, Stacey McCormick, who's trying to theorize reproductive justice, but keep it expansive to all and the flowing ways that people show up in gendered. But also the language is telling. And this is where being rooted once again, or being informed through Black feminists and disability justice frames can be really useful. So when we hear geriatric, there is an ageism in there that's woven into medical training. That's neither here nor there, but within there's a set of assumptions that then determine kind of care that you receive, including being automatically placed as high risk or not, irregardless of other factors. And so part of my work, and this is where you see my training in literary and cultural studies, is to examine the language and what the language reveals about the unstated and the or under interrogated assumptions that we have about different people's bodies. So for instance, with the geriatric at 35, that tells a lot about not just the state of one's body, because people have different states of their body at 35, right? But more so the ways that society caps a value on women in general. By the time you hit your 30s, I remember it used to be like the death, right? Like you no longer had value. That's changing a little bit, but also in part because of ableism. We show these beautiful celebrities who are in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, like, look, it's okay to be older, but even that requires being able to embody a certain state of beauty and health. And so the geriatric also has a set of assumptions that we have about what bodies can and cannot do at certain ages as well. So I would say I would love for people to become more versed in what's going on in reproductive justice, Black feminist theory, disability studies, to have the tools to better interrogate the language that we use so that when you hear certain terms, you're like, wait, there's more being said here and assumed here.
Thank you. Yes.
You're done there.
Thank you so much for presenting this again. It was really interesting to hear more about, and I was curious about asking you more about your perspectives and choices that you made related to your birth, especially in regards to like disability justice and like Black womanhood, or about Black birthing in general. And so what I kind of wanted to ask was related to like how you informed your decisions, because I know that obviously you're studying this from like an academic standpoint, and there's like a lot that you already know from taking in literature, but I was kind of curious, like, did you connect to any like communities of people who are going through similar experiences, whether this is from like a disability perspective, Black birthing perspective, or like intersection of both of them, and just like how did you access that to inform your care, if that makes sense?
I think I understand what you're asking. And so when I share my personal experiences very much from like, traditional feminist, the personal and political, but also very much what Audre Lorde says, that survival is not an academic exercise. And what's interesting about being in my case, like a predominantly white space puts me in with a different class of individuals, it also isolated me from community. I was in Texas this time around with no real kinfolk, and one of my first publications, which is in a collection on Toni Morrison and Mothers and Mothering, is investigating what it looks like to be displaced like that through her representation of migrants. So specifically Pilot from Song of Solomon, and how one builds community. And so in a very real way, literary communities, literary ancestors, and even academic imagined communities were a sustaining force. I would not have made that decision had I not encountered the body of work in disability studies that pointed to how it's ableism that determines that some bodies deserve to reproduce, that some genes are better than others, that even our continued fascination and our medical technical ability to tweak genes as part of ongoing histories of eugenics. And so it was within that class, and even the professor at the time, that was a source of motivation, and being able to actually take a step back and think about that academically before applying it personally, that was really useful. And so that's why I see the value, the beauty and the value of these kinds of talks and these kinds of community spaces. So yeah, because as Lauren said, survival is an academic exercise.
Thank you so much. This is, I have a 9-month-old and this really resonated, your talk resonated with my many ways. But I was particularly struck by this idea that health is fluid, moving and changing, and sort of like rethinking what we consider health to be health, which I never really thought about what a sort of static and sort of, like a static concept and singular concept health is. And I'm really interested in this idea of incorporating disability into the way we think about and talk about reproductive medicine, reproductive justice, and particularly Black motherhood. And so I'm wondering, I guess I'm sort of thinking about the ways that health is presented so statically in visual culture and social media as just this sort of pinnacle of beauty, and momfluencers and pregnancy is like so beautiful and don't be gross, like that kind of stuff. What would it look like to incorporate disability into visual culture? Is it possible to do that? Do you have any examples? Or yeah, I'm just curious your thoughts about that.
It's a great question. And disability is everywhere. Representation of disability is everywhere in our literature and our visual culture. I think it's learning a critical vocabulary for interpreting what that looks like. And it's everywhere, even as it's actively marginalized and erased. And so a profound moment, for instance, for me, I was reading a chapter by feminist crip queer scholar Allison Kafer called Ashley X Out of Time in her book Feminist Crip Queer. And she was doing an analysis of how this family was engaging with their severely disabled daughter. They were trying to freeze her in time and arguing that it'll make care easier, it'll protect her. And I believe in there, Kafer mentioned in passing, it might not have been her, the show that came on TLC, the network, years and years ago. And I remember watching that before entering grad school and returning to it. And it was, TLC is the absolute best and the worst, and you want to see Texas diversity. They have rightfully argued it in many ways. It's a contemporary freak show. And at the same time, in other moments, when allowed, it's a place for those who otherwise wouldn't be able to control their own narrative to produce counter narratives. And so I had to return to my moment of watching this particular show about this woman who used a wheelchair. She's a paraplegic and she decided to get pregnant. And of course, the show being exploitative, edited and produced it in a way that pathologized her decision. She was presented as irresponsible. After becoming pregnant and giving birth, she lost some more of her abilities and so on and so forth. And honestly, at the time of the showing, and once again, this is before being introduced to a critical disability studies perspective, it was intriguing, and it was really easy to get looped into that logic. But returning, I think even that show would be a good and a really useful example of what you're saying, because she did parent. She had a helper that was able to hold the baby, bring the infant up to her. She had days where she couldn't. She had delayed eventually because of severe vertigo, I believe. She was more so reclined most of the time than sitting up. And you had a chance to see what this day-to-day interactions was like. Now within ableist society, every moment of her quote unquote failure to parent in ways that we prescribe is evidence of her poor decision making as a disabled woman through a disability justice lens where we recognize that she's hypervisible, and if we pull back, in many ways, it was just a really human response. As a parent, I have days where I'm laid out. Oh goodness, when I had COVID, there was even a moment where I was like, my daughter's older now and very much independent in some respects. I'm like FaceTiming her. I'm like, you good? She's like, okay, I'm good. I'm like, okay, I'll be out there later. But you can see counter stories of what parenting mother work can look like, even when occupying more severe or intense disabilities such as that. And so that immediately popped into my mind. And it would be interesting to see this more widespread and in ways that's less exploitative. The issue is also disabled women regardless of race, and particularly in Black women regardless of ability, and particularly Black disabled women are under higher surveillance when they are parents and at greater risk of losing custody of their children if they are not performing to expectations that able-bodied or white parents perform into. And so that representation would also require creating a system that's not punitive towards not living up to certain ideals, and their ideals. No one lives up to them of parenting, and also models of interdependence that's also really active in Black and disabled communities.
Yeah, I just want to highlight that last thing because the example you gave was included someone handing the baby to this woman and just sort of like accentuating communities of care, and that it's not just this sort of rigidly individualistic kind of act.
Yeah, I feel like it's great talk. I was thinking about talking about your responses to some of the questions that were kind of dancing around the idea of like a solution. I very much got the sense that, from your responses, there's not one magic bullet solution, obviously. And furthermore, you really beautifully emphasized this idea. I mean, it's ugly, it's not beautiful, but like the idea that, misogyny and ableism are very much like systemic issues within the medical system. But what I was kind of wondering is, to what degree of stock would you put in the idea that one potential partial solution to this multifaceted issue is like more doctors in the system who maybe are not white, Black doctors, female or non-binary doctors, differently disabled doctors? Like, do you think that could make a difference, or is it? I mean, obviously it's hard to say for sure, but how much power would you maybe ascribe to that in a potential, moving forward for better outcomes for Black birthing people on this?
There has been research that suggests that having a diverse doctor base is going to improve health outcomes, and that's just in general. Those who are rooted in the health humanities, I think rightfully put forth the argument that good care requires cultural and community competency. I would caution with my work in that simply switching out the actors doesn't interrogate the system and some of the assumptions of the practices of the system itself. I think some of them can naturally be challenged and interrogated just by having someone with different perspectives and that cultural and community competency and commitment to care and activism. But there is going to also need to have that deep engagement of going back to the foundations. A great example is that part of this conversation about Black maternal mortality rates has been a reckoning with the history of gynecology and its origins in misogyny. And a disability informed analysis or intervention into that reckoning is recognizing even some of the ableism that informs the very methods and questions that was being asked for these medical procedures. And you see a lot of this in disability studies and the medical humanities, saying not only do we need to address the explicit biases, but even the ways that they're built in to the very procedures. I think Christina Sharp's engagement with what is it, the spirometer with asthma was an excellent example, and just the book that inspired that. I can't think of it. It's one that I'm working with now for a new project. How even in the metal, and this is also Dorothy Roberts and Alondra Nelson, they're doing this work. It's so systemic that it's even built into the very technology itself. You can't pick up the tool without the racist and sexist and ableist assumptions being constitutive of the material object or whatever set of practices. I also tend to be more pessimistic.
That's what I was curious about, yeah.
Yeah.
You really answered it, thank you.
Any final questions or comments? I suppose I have to do my due diligence, which is to highlight the extent to which the humanities and a specifically humanities perspective can offer these insights that you cannot get from only a medical or scientific or perspective, right? So we really appreciate like how you can enlist the imagination, how stories can convey information, how analysis is central to thinking through a lot of these really hard questions. So that was I did my job. Thank you once again for just such a incredibly insightful and rich talk. So please join me in thanking.